Perfect, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for attending. We're going to get started with Parent to Parent, Real Talk from Real Thrivers. And this is our first session of 4, which is Deconstructing the Years That Made Us. So to get started, the National American Indian and Alaska Native Childhood Trauma Treatment Service and Adaptation Center is supported by a grant from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is SAMHSA. And the content of this event is the creation of the presenters, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native NCTSN. So before we get started, I'm going to give everyone the next 2 minutes to read our land acknowledgement. This was developed by 3 of our staff members, Ella Driscoll, Keely Driscoll, and Sean Bear. So I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes to read. Thank you all for taking that time to read that. After this presentation, we will be sending out, following today's event, you should receive a follow-up email that has presentation slides, as well as the recording on our YouTube, which if you're interested in looking at some of our other events, you can go to the Native Center for Behavioral Health YouTube channel and look at our previous recordings, as well as any resources and links shared in the chat box, and a link to our evaluation survey, which you should get at the end. And during the session, we will also be sending out the registration links for the rest of the series. So I'm going to hand it over to Teresa to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. And I am very pleased to be here today. This is something we've been working on for a very long time. So I am just looking forward to listening and learning. My name is Teresa Branton. I work for the Native Center for Behavioral Health. I'm the co-director of the National Trauma Center. We are a Category 2 grant. I'm also the co-director of the Mental Health Technology K-12 Center. I think I said this, Coherian Lumbee, but I live on the Meskwaki tribe here in Iowa with my husband and our granddaughter. And again, just thanks. And I'm glad everybody's here today, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Sadoff. I am the program coordinator for the Native Center, or not the Native Center, the National American Indian and Childhood Trauma TSA Category 2. I recently graduated with my master's in public health in community and behavioral health from the University of Iowa, and I also am a certified health education specialist. And then I'm going to introduce Eleanor, unless she wants to introduce herself. This is Eleanor. She is our amazing GRA. She helps us with all of our amazing projects, and she is currently pursuing a degree in counseling in mental health. So with that, I am going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and first hand it off to Melanie Johnson.
Aho, Nadeshi Kiskichi. Hello, I'm Melanie Johnson. I am Sac and Fox on my mother's side, and I'm Mexican on my father's side. I reside here in Norman, Oklahoma with my 2 daughters and my husband. I have been working in the field of prevention for about 9 years. I am the director of the Whole Child Initiative at the National Indian Education Association. So I'm just really happy and pleased to be here. Raquel? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's Lucina.
Good afternoon, everybody. Han Misakuyape, greetings, relatives. Tanya Yahiba Chante Washdeya Chizapi. It is good that you are all here, and I offer you a heartfelt handshake. Mishnina Iyokpia Wahie. Speaking for myself, I am very honored and happy to be here today. Tateo Jaja Wi Imakiapie. My Dakota name is Shining Light Wind Woman, and my American name is Lestina Salmadasi. I currently work as a behavioral health counselor and project coordinator for Project Beacon, which addresses sex trafficking and human trafficking in the American Indian and Alaska Native communities. And I'm very happy to be here, and I believe I will introduce Raquel.
I apologize. I think our order got mixed up for the beginning portion. So this is Cynthia Goslin. She is not one of our main presenters today, but she is going to be offering her personal stories through the next following sessions. And if she would, I think she's on the call. So if she would like to jump in and add anything about herself, she is completely welcome to.
Hello, I am here today with everyone. Thank you. As she said, my name is Cynthia Goslin. I am an enrolled member of the Kickapoo tribe of Kansas. I am also Muskogee Creek. I do have lived experience, and I am excited to be a part of this. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Cynthia. And now we are going on to Raquel.
So after 3 introductions, yay me, Hamadawe Gananiatsa Raquel Ramos, Nutsay Namana. Hi, my name is Raquel Ramos, and I work for the National Indian Education Association as a prevention specialist for the Whole Child Initiative. And I'm just thankful to be here, and I hope that everyone just takes the opportunity to just listen to what each presenter has to say. And thank you.
All right, and then I will hand it off to Ronnie.
Madowe. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ronald Watkini. I am Comanche, and I am the Associate Director of the Oklahoma Association on Problem Gambling and Gaming in Norman, Oklahoma. I'm also a licensed alcohol and drug counselor with the state, and I'm just excited to be here and hope everybody enjoys the presentation today. Thank you.
And then to follow Ronald is Ronalda.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Ronalda Tomorito. I'm Dene, reside from Albuquerque, New Mexico. My clans are Hushglishni, which is the Mud Clan, and my father's side, it's Dene, I'm sorry, I just completely went blank. Noshasha Dene, the Bear Clan. And I have grown up on the reservation, but my current job right now, it's really my vision is I'm an advocate for Native American children with disabilities. I work all over the country, but I predominantly help mentor parents within our communities to be these strong advocates for their child with disabilities. It's really great to be here.
And then Maria was unable to be with us today, but she is going to be one of our future panelists, and I will give everybody a moment to read her bio, and you can also see all of our panelists' bios in the ad that was sent out. So I'm going to give everyone a minute, and then we will keep going. Thank you so much for taking the time to read her bio. So this is Parent to Parent Real Talk from Real Thrivers. And today's section is Deconstructing the Years That Made Us. So the Parent to Parent Real Talk, Real Thrivers series aims to inspire Native parents to break the cycle of trauma with their children. This wonderful group of Native parents has come together to tell their personal stories and about their healing. This was originally called Breaking the Cycle, but they came together and talked about how to be more than survivors. They became thrivers. And so the overall goal of this series is to acknowledge the past, present, future, and strengths of Native parents to do the same to heal collectively and break the cycle. In this session, we have our amazing speakers taking a deeper look back in history at the events and policies that have impacted and shaped American Indian and Alaska Native lives. They're connecting our past and how it impacts our ancestors and the way they were raised and how it continues to impact us. This is the first of four sessions in the month of September. So if you would like to register for the other 3 sessions, we will put the registration link in the chat box both now and at the end of the session. And before we open up to our speakers to get started, is there anything you would like to add to this brief introduction, Teresa?
No, Liz, I think that was a great job you did. I do want to start off by thanking the panelists for being here. As you can see, they are professionals, but they are also parents, and they are also Native Americans with lived experiences, which is why they are here today. They are going to be speaking from the heart and about their personal stories. Let's please be respectful to them as they do so. And I just thank them so much for doing this. This is something we've been talking about for a very long time, and I think it's much needed. Our goal here is to really just hear from parents who have done things in the past, but have now gone through their healing journey and are doing big and better things. And it's here for one, just to not only tell their personal stories, to tell what made them go on the right path to doing the right thing by their children, but the reasons why this is happening to our Native families, because it is happening over and over again. And this is just our attempt of breaking the cycle and doing better for our children and our children's children. Thank you, everyone, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And we're now going to get started, and I'm going to hand it off to Melanie.
All right, thank you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So give me a sec. Okay. I'm going to go for it there. And hopefully I will show the right screen. Well, I am sharing my screen, but it doesn't look like it's moving along. I don't know if Liz, if you would be able to share it for me.
Yep, I got you.
Okay.
All right. Just tell me when to flip slides.
All right. Go ahead and flip the slide. I am going to be sharing a lot of the information that we at the National Indian Education Association are proud to be a part of, this initiative. So we're going to start with talking a little bit about the foundation and the history before we jump into personal stories. And I wanted to share this photo. It starts with the Arawak Indians, who were the first Native people who were encountered by Christopher Columbus on Hispaniola. And one of the reasons is it's a key historical event that happened, not with my family, but just with all families that have been a part of historical trauma and individual tribal nations. It's a general timeline when our American Indian way of life was changed drastically, and our traditional ways of life were taken, and many historical influences that have impacted how we conduct ourselves as Native people. And we have survived these atrocities, but at the same time, we are still being impacted with it, and we still continue to deal with it. Next slide, please. So this sort of gives us a timeline, a very shortened timeline of deconstructing the years that made us. And if we look at the pre-colonial time equals the traditional life at its fullest and purest, right? We start with 1492 with the colonial and the non-native contact changing American Indian lives. We look at the changed, continued broken treaties, the forced assimilations, and it can go on and on as we look at federal Indian policies and how those policies really affected our interactions with our family. Alcohol was introduced to Indigenous people throughout all these Indian policies, and it was potent. Social drinking was a format by European colonizers, and I wanted to just move my screen a little so I could see this. But before colonization, some tribes had weaker beers or fermented beverages that were primarily used for ceremonies. However, when European colonizers came to this land, they introduced more potent alcohols, as well as a culture of excess and abusive consumption habits. And colonizers often used alcohol as a device to weaken Indigenous people during those negotiations and hostilities. So in light of how natives were introduced to alcohol, it is not surprising to see how the relationship between the two have proven to be more challenging And it's been reported that 12% of all Native American deaths have been linked to alcoholism, and more than 3 times the national average. So considering that fact, we make up less than 2% of the nation. The full detriment of the statistic begins to surface. Next slide, please. So through these statistics and what we know about it, assimilation and the road to genocide started. And some of the quotes were that it's cheaper to educate Indians than to kill them. And that's where NIA sort of comes into play with educational sovereignty and how education was used to weaponize, and weaken our families, unfortunately. And the next one is from an Indian school superintendent talking about the only alternative left is civilization or annihilation, absorption, or extermination. Only by complete isolation of the Indian child from his savage antecedents can be satisfactorily educated. So, just looking at those terms and the feeling that you get from that, you kind of get the sense where this is going for families. And so I wanted to just talk about the assimilation and how it created a divide between urban Indian and reservation and rural Indian life. Next slide, please. So American Indians and alcohol. These are some of the things that we've run into. I have been a certified prevention specialist for, probably about 5 or 6 years. And one of the things that I can talk about in our personal stories is, the first taste of alcohol, what that felt like, what that was for me. But in this particular photo, you'll see that the European fur traders were doing business with Native Americans in 1777. So there's a barrel of rum to the left. And so it really is a way to show how poisonous the alcohol was, and it weakened our families with this introduction. It was also a part of our nation's past since the landing of the Pilgrims. Drinking was pervasive because alcohol was regarded by the Europeans as a healthy substance with preventative and curative powers, and it wasn't seen as an intoxicant. But now we know that alcoholism was a product of liquid genocide. Next slide, please. So in this picture, it really depicts what I'm getting at here, the history of alcohol and the non-medical drug use that changed over time due to the development of policies. And so these changes had radical and class overtones. According to Mosher, which is where I quoted these from, in the Prohibition, there was a part of response to drinking practices of European immigrants. So it became the new lower class. And cocaine and opium were legal during the 19th century, believe it or not, and were favored drugs among the upper and middle class. However, cocaine became illegal after it was restricted when it became associated with Chinese immigrant workers. And marijuana was legal until the 1930s when it became associated with Mexicans. LSD in the 1950s became something that was a part-time use. It also was something that I think, looking back in the 1950s, became illegal in 1967, but it became associated with the counterculture. So what I'm trying to get to is how these substances are connected to people of color, and how that framework began to work against our Native American people. Next slide, please. This next photo is something that I saw in my work with NIA, and I really looked at this quote and I thought about it. This is one of the things that we're talking about today. If a child hasn't been given spiritual values within the family setting, they have no familiarity with the values that are necessary for the just and peaceful functioning in society. And I thought this picture kind of depicted, what we're talking about and what we're getting at. Next slide, please. But there was a time that substance abuse was not an issue in our history. So in our cultures, usually the elders and others in the community that tribal members go to for guidance or advice were there for us. They were knowledge keepers in how prevention takes place in our culture. They understood that everyone had a particular role to play in the community. We had healthy and harmonious and balance in our communities. It was also known that elders had a cultural way of life functions to keep the life in balance, and that with everything that we did, it had a purpose and it had a function. And through these teachings, we were reminded that we're not only living in vain and to maintain our community's life, but we must pay homage to the ancestors and be in ultimate gratitude to our Creator. So this concept expands beyond our individual health to natural health and the natural order of things. It's everyone's responsibility to keep the circle of life in harmony for ourselves and for the next 7 generations. But looking at this photo and thinking about the next 7 generations, who would have thought that we would still be here coming from this upbringing from our ancestors and where we are guided to in our futures and the things that we had to endure. Next slide, please. So this last, almost to the last slide, is really showing that this is what broke us. This is the brokenness that made us. Assimilation created cultural divide between our urban Indian and our reservation or in our rural Indian life. And these are all pieces as a result of broken treaties with Native American tribes from 1778 to 1871. And the United States signed some 368 treaties with various indigenous people across North America. This is taken from the Quanah training, gathering of Native Americans, and it's also a way to give a visual of how these pieces were created. It's a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from massive group trauma. And the effects of this historical trauma against American Indians and population, it's an unsettled emotional trauma, depression, high mortality rates, high rates of alcohol, and significant problems of child abuse and domestic violence. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to leave you with is, when we are born, we start with a beautiful empty mind ready to give our beliefs and our attitudes and our habits and expectations. Most of true learning comes from watching the actions of others. As we watch our family or relatives, whatever actions and values are, so will be the children's values and acts. If we see our families living a just and peaceful way of life, so then will the children. So that cycle of life, baby, youth, adult, and elder is all connected. If the older ones have good values, it will be connected to the children. I really think that speaks to what we are about to embark upon in this 4-part series. Last slide, please. And just remember, as we look back into our history and at the events and policies that have shaped our lives, starting with our ancestors and how it continues to impact us and our children today, you will come to understand that you are the medicine. Ketepi, thank you. And now I will pass it on to Raquel.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can we see my screen? Yes? Okay, thank you. So once again, these are the National Indian Education's boarding school. They have a boarding school curriculum that they do, and so we just adapted it to this training. So I want to share this picture. Melanie had spoke about the assimilation, the road to cultural genocide. And this picture is really profound. Whenever we see these 3 Lakota boys after assimilation to the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, looking at it, of course, there's no smiles. There was no smiles before and after. But then whenever you see it, I think that there was and this is my own personal thought, I think that there was a purpose for this, because I never noticed until I started paying more attention. But if you look at the carpet on there, the carpet is exactly the same as the pre, along with the post. And so, it was meant to showcase what they have done to our students, what they've done to our young people whenever they went into the boarding schools. And so currently there is an organization called the Native American Rights Fund, and they pursue strategies to support the healing of boarding school survivors and Native American children, families, communities, and tribal nations. And one of the reasons why I put this in there, and I'm going to give everyone a moment to either write down, I don't know if I can copy it, or Liz, if you can copy the YouTube onto the chat, because this YouTube is longer than my 10 minutes. However, I think that it's very, very important. So I want to give everybody an opportunity to look at that, and I'll put it in the chat before the end of this session. And so in 1879, the United States Indian Training and Industrial School at Carlisle sent a group of 84 Lakota children. They arrived at the newly established site, Carlisle Indian School. And the school was founded by the former American Indian fighter, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, to remove young American Indians from the native culture and refashion them as members of mainstream American society. Over the next 2 decades, 24 more schools on the Carlisle model will be established outside the reservations, along with 81 boarding and nearly 150 day schools of American Indian-owned land. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So whenever we think of these young people in this boarding school, I can't even imagine in my mind, as I personally have 17 grandchildren. I personally have 1 great-grandchild, and I have 1 great-grandchild on the way. And I'm just 40, and but I just can't even imagine, seeing one of my grandchildren in this formation right here, standing, taking these photos. And, it's the boarding school that broke the spirit of our young people. And so the truth about the U.S. Indian boarding school policy has largely been written out of the history books. There were almost 500 government-funded, church-run Indian boarding schools across the U.S. in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indian children were forcibly abducted by government agents, sent to schools hundreds of miles away, beaten, starved, or otherwise abused when they spoke their native language. Once again, as a parent, as a great-grandparent, and as a grandmother, I just can't imagine this happening. And I can't imagine the trauma that followed, which we're going to get into a little bit later on when Miss Rolanda speaks. It is, we don't think about it as we go through life. And it took me until my older years to realize that the trauma that these young relatives faced are the same traumas that my great-grandmother faced, the same ones that my grandmother faced, as well as my mother, and eventually got passed down to me. And I think that there is a lot of hurt that we, as a Native community, as a Native population, and through this training over the next 4 days or over the next 4 sessions, that we're going to be able to break some cycles as we all begin to thrive together. And so as the boarding schools go along, by the early 1930s, an estimated 2/3 of Native Americans had attended boarding school at some point in their life. 350 boarding schools in 29 states, 100,000 children between 1879 and the 1960s. And in 1973, 60,000 in off-reservation schools. So there was a study that came out called the Miriam Report because they were wanting to know, Honorable Hubert Work was the Secretary of Interior, and he wanted to know what was going on in these schools. And so institutional work by very small children who, according to medical opinions, are malnourished. Nearly every boarding school visited furnished disquieting illustrations of failure to understand the underlying principles of human behavior. Punishments of the most harmful sort are bestowed in sheer ignorance. Mass movement from dormitory to dining room, from dining room to classroom, from classroom back again, completely controlled by external authority. We should hardly have children, from smallest to largest, of both sexes lined up in military formation, and lock the door to the fire escape to the girls' dormitory. Serious malnutrition, lack of recreational opportunities, of lighting, ventilation, an abnormally long day, which cuts to a dangerous point the normal allowance for sleep and rest. The general routinized nature of institutional life with its formalism of classrooms, its marching and dress parade, its annihilation of initiative, lack of beauty, its almost complete negation of normal family life, all of which have deleterious effects upon mental health and the development of a wholesome personality. Among no other people, so far as is known, are as large a proportion of the total of children of school age located in institutions away from their homes as among Indian under the boarding school policy, and no attempt at the follow-up of those who leave before or at graduation. And for everyone on the call, which I'm pretty sure they know, that last statement, these were all from the actual report itself, but the last statement, we know were some of the ones who would leave were found not very long ago in mass graves. In boarding schools, as a result of Indian children welfare policy, the problem is systematic. In 1958, as the Indian boarding schools were starting to wane, the Bureau of Indian Affairs created the Indian Adoption Project. Both the U.S. Indian boarding schools and the Indian adoption policies were initially designed to force assimilation and eradicate native cultures and family systems. By the 1960s, about 1 in 4 children were living apart from their families. During this era, social workers found more dubious ways of taking children from their homes. And so the impact of our boarding schools as individuals today, we have a loss of our identity, no sense of safety, difficulty forming healthy relationships. Within our families, we have loss of parental power. In our tribal communities, loss of sense of community. We have a loss of our language. And within our tribal nations, we have a weakened nation structure, and we have depleted numbers of enrollment. And some of that even attributes to us being placed on a, we have to prove that we're Indian. It's only dog breeds and horses in the United States, as well as Native Americans today, that have to prove who we are. So resilience through self-determination. So today we reverse 30 plus years of termination and serving of any treaty obligations, created 638 contracting, which allows tribes to contract federal programs, allowed tribes to operate their own schools. Tribes manage 126 of the 183 schools in the BIA system. Educational sovereignty, we take control of our education, our language, our beliefs, and our cultural philosophies. And tribes have control of the education process to develop our future leaders through education sovereignty, which is one of the things that NIA stands on. And so I'm going to keep this up here for a second, which I believe I read that the slides will be shared. Go on there and look at each of the slides. And I want to leave you with, to reflect and share. America has always used school as a weapon against Native Americans. It's our job now to turn that around. Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to Listina.
All right, good afternoon again, everybody. So I'm going to be presenting on Indian orphanages, and the timeline for this is 1855 to 1978. Next slide, please. So some of the things that contributed to the American Indian orphanages were Custer's defeat, which contributed to the mistreatment of Native American children. The 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre also contributed to the mistreatment of Native children. Disease, relocation, and war killed off tribes, family members, and destroyed communities. A loss of traditional tribal roles and a major dismantle of the kinship system contributed to communities in crisis, which contributed to children needing institutional care. To some, they signified culture collapse with a strong emphasis on Americanization and assimilation. It is also important to note that these significant historical events negatively affected the way that Western society viewed Native children, with little to no empathy. As a result, the children suffered. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I have a picture of the Tecowitha Indian Orphanage that was located in Sisseton, South Dakota. It is no longer there. They tore it down, and there's a garden that's built in its place called Memorial Garden. However, the first American orphanage was founded in New York in 1855 for the Seneca Nation. Other tribes that opened orphanages were the Choctaw of Oklahoma. They had 5 of them. The Sioux in South Dakota had Tecowitha, which was actually by the Catholic Church. The Ojibwe had an orphanage. The Cherokee Nation, the Creek Nation had 2 different ones. One was for their children, and the other one was for their children of Creek freedmen. Traditionally, the community members or family members would take in the orphan children. However, U.S. policy to assimilate overturned the traditional way of life through forced assimilation. Most of the orphanages in Oklahoma, which had the most, did not survive the Dawes Commission and the dissolution of tribal government in the early 20th century. The few that did were taken over by the federal government and soon became typical boarding schools. These schools produced similar results, such as the boarding schools, and often followed their suit when adapting sports or other academic activities. Next slide, please. So I am actually going to give a little bit of my family history during my part of this presentation. I'm going to use my grandma Shirley Keeble as a case study to help define like what these children experienced at these boarding schools. So my grandma Shirley was one of 4 children who was orphaned when her mother passed away from a disease. My grandfather could not take care of the children, so he left them at Tecowitha Orphanage. I had a younger grandma that was there that was only 4 years old, and she didn't come out of there. She didn't survive. And they said that she ran away when she was 4 years old. And when she came back to the orphanage, or when they found her, she came back and passed away from pneumonia. But that's the story that they told us. I beg to differ. You know, they don't even have pictures or records of the orphanage. So we really don't know how much of that story is true. And based on other survivors of that era that have come forward and said that they suffered a lot of abuse, I don't know that I actually believe that version of the story, but it is what they're saying. So the nuns and priests that were in charge of the kids there were very cold-hearted. My grandma did not receive any of the normal nurturing that we give our children as kids. There was nobody there to tell her, I love you, I'm proud of you, or to give her hugs. Next slide, please. And so as a result of that, she ended up retaining her language, and she remembered her language, even though they tried to beat it out of her. And as an elder, she still spoke her language. And I wanted to bring up the effects of no nurturing, because as a result of her not receiving that, when she came home from the boarding school and common law married my grandpa, they had 11 children, and my mother's the oldest. And she said that their mom never gave them any hugs or showed them any affection. And knowing now what we know, like about generational trauma, we believe that that started in that orphanage, that because of the nuns were so mean to her that when she came home, she didn't know how to show love. And you can't do something unless you're taught how to do that. So I think that that orphanage basically beat that out of her. And if we were to give my grandma an ACEs test today, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, I bet that her score would be high. And my grandma did end up passing away at the young age of 49 from disease too. Next slide, please. So some of the impacts of Americanization and colonization were the loss of language, the loss of traditional use of herbal remedies and medicines, the loss of traditions through forced Christianity, loss of identity through cutting off the hair, destruction of traditional clothing, and the loss of religious practices and dances until 1978, unless they were done in secret. And I also want to bring to light some of the survivor testimonies from the Tekawitha Orphanage. And some of these kids preferred to remain anonymous because of the shame that surrounds like their sexual abuse and just coming forward. But a lot of the male students that were in that orphanage said that they suffered sexual abuse in the restrooms by the priests, and that sometimes when the toys were donated to the orphanage at Christmas time, that the nuns and the priests would use those toys to sexually assault the children. So something that was supposed to be a good thing was turned into an evil event. There's also a story of a young boy in there who had dyslexia, and he was punished because he wasn't talking as quickly as the nuns wanted him to. And they thought he was faking that disease, so they would slap his hands and slap his eyes to try to get him to listen. And I also want to touch on the word oppression, because that's exactly what they said happened there, that oppression was completed at that orphanage. And oppression is the prolonged and excessive cruel treatment of somebody or unjust treatment of somebody to basically get them to stop being Indian. Like the presenter before, we said, kill the man or kill the Indian and save the man. Next slide, please. So even though we have that horrid or that chapter of history that was meant to destroy us, we're still here today. And there is a big push on language revitalization within each tribe. My grandpa Clifford Chunku has always said, if you want to know your culture, you need to know your language, because if you understand your language, you'll understand your culture. So let's see here. I'm sorry, I got lost on my slides. So many tribes are bringing back their languages, and with that, they're bringing back their traditions, spirituality, and ways of living. And it's never too late to learn your language. I think that most of these tribes have some type of summit that meets every year to try to figure out the language, or to make a written record of the language, or produce videos that help people to speak their language. And I want to shine a light on the Navajo and Dene tribe, because they have the largest population of fluent speakers in the American Indian tribes. Next slide. And that is the end of my presentation. And this is one of the references that I used to get my information. And the other information that I had was passed down through family history and stories. And with that, I will pass to Reynalda.
Oh, Ronaldo, you're muted.
There I am. Can you hear me? So I decided to do this in a different way. And what happened with me and in my journey was I started to really look at my family history. And in the midst of looking at it, that's where I started to see these patterns. So what I'm going to do is just share with you my family history to the point until I was born, and I can go into that next time. But just to show you how the historical lineage, but also how policies and laws and trauma has continually carried forth and has, until the present time. So next slide. So my personal family history related to policies and traumas. Next slide. So I'm going to start off first with my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Maria Beta. And her clan was Hushklishni, which is the Mud Clan. And that, that is one of the pieces that we don't reiterate a lot about. Even though we had these atrocities that occurred, our clanship is still there. And that's one thing I was really grateful for, even though it was not really expressed because of Christianity. So Maria Beta was born in 1857. But in 1864, at 7 years old, she walked the long walk of the Navajos from Western Navajo to Fort Sumner. The long walk spanned over 300 miles in one direction. And the federal government claimed this as the Hard Winter Campaign. Their intention was to teach the tribe a lesson. 8,000 Navajos made this walk. What's pretty interesting about this, when you start looking at the whole relocation of Native tribes, not only from the eastern side, but the western side, and how all these tribes went into Oklahoma. What I found very significant about the Navajos is I really thought there was a gap within 1865 or the 1860s all the way to 1870s that after reviewing all of the span of tribes, I was trying to ask the question about whether the Navajos were also going to be marched all the way to Oklahoma, because they stopped in Bosque Redondo and didn't proceed on. So they stayed there for about 3 years, maybe 4. So many died en route to Bosque Redondo, some too weak to march, some were shot by soldiers. The Navajos were held in captivity until 1868. Maria Beta lost her parents and was then watched over by a soldier. She eventually died from the 1918 influenza. Her and her husband both died. It's pretty amazing that she endured the long walk, but it was the influenza that killed her. But it was that walk alone that has really affected not only a majority of Navajos, but there were some Navajos who didn't walk that walk. So those families who did endure that have endured trauma in the sense and everything else that comes with it. Next slide. So what I wanted to do during the course of my grandmother, I looked at the laws that were going on at that time. And here in New Mexico, back in 1600s, we had our first mission, and it was with the Pueblos of our Franciscans. And so the religious aspect started here in New Mexico very early. And I'm sure most of you know about the Pueblo revolt that occurred during that era in 1690s, around there. But in 1830 was the Indian Removal Act. And that's when my grandmother, Maria Beta, was born. So in the midst of all of those things, laws were shifting and everything was moving along. And then in 1860 to the 1890s, Indian wars started occurring and the boarding school starts to begin, because you're starting to move many of our people to some of the reservations and then starting these schools. But during that time, that's when my mother, 1863, she walked the long walk, lost her mother, father, and siblings. She was taken care of by a federal soldier, like I said before. But after she returned, she was placed on the reservation, adopted by an uncle, and then lived in Fort Defiance. She married, and she had three kids. And then in 1884, during the Indian Census Act, she was counted in that census. And then in 1887, the Dawes or General Allotment Act came in and blood quantum begins. She never was returned home, and she was shifted to Fort Defiance, and that's where she was raised. And the placement of her, we often hear about her through the uncle that raised her. She became a very prominent woman, and in Navajo, her Navajo name meant that she was a big woman. And I didn't get to share her latest picture, but she adored herself with jewelry all over because she was working with a trader many times. So she got her jewelry and all of her clothing. So she was known as a woman who was adored with jewelry. Next slide. Now, this is my grandmother. This is Maria Beta's daughter. Ella Chester Morgan, she's my maternal grandmother. She's also Hushklishni from the Mud Clan. But Ella was born during the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919. And during this time, many Native Americans lost their lives and families were destroyed. So she lost her mother, Maria Beta, and her father during that time. And then she was raised by an aunt and an uncle. She eventually went on to school at the Albuquerque Indian School, which was a boarding school. And she went on to become a nurse. She worked in the Indian Health Service for over 30 years. Ella spoke Navajo and English. She married at 23 and gave birth to my mother in 1943. And eventually she had 4 other children, and they all attended the Christian boarding school. What's odd about the Christian boarding school here in New Mexico, it's called Rehoboth. At the time, it's one of these things where these schools shift. And as we were listening to the previous speakers, this particular school did take children away, but now eventually, and as time has proceeded, now it's a prominent school. Many Navajos go there and it's a private school, they pay for their education. But there's many things that happen in there, and to bring those things up is also another question. And that school was called Rehoboth. So as my grandmother attended, she was a Christian or became a Christian. She knew Navajo, like we said before, and English, but she never really went into more of the traditional ceremonies, and that was never passed on to her daughter, my mother. Her marriage lasted for 60 years until my grandfather's death in 2011. And she died at the age of 96 years old in the year 2014. She lived a very prominent life, and it was really amazing to see her and to watch her. And but her big thing, and I remember going in the summer camps in the summertime to go stay with her. And we always went to the vacation Bible schools. She lived in this little community in Church Rock called the Indian Village. And it was these apartments that were made just for certain families to stay there, because my grandfather worked for the Fort Wingate, the Army Depot. So there were houses there for them, but they weren't prominent houses. They were just these small little apartments that they chose to live in. But her life was one during the time of, the transfer of land. She didn't get that. She just had her apartment. We were always wondering why other family members had some pieces of land, but she wasn't given that. And I don't know if it was because she decided to go on to school and choose more of a modern life. Next slide. Now, Mary Warito is my father's mother, and she's the paternal grandmother. And her clan was Nashosha-Dene, and it's the Bear Enemies clan. She was born in November of 1911, and this is her standing right there. And my father is the little boy that's standing right in front of her. So she was born in the remote areas of Tresca Mountain, which is near Tohatchi, New Mexico. She was given up to relatives at age 6 because her family and mother and father also died during the 1918 influenza. Her parents died, I said that. She was given away at 14 years old to be married, and Mary had 5 children. When she was given away, she was in Tresca Mountain, which is right in the center almost of Navajo. But then she ended up moving to Herfano, which is just in the Four Corners area, a little more east of that. That's where she resided all her life. She never attended school, and she only spoke Navajo, which was pretty amazing for somebody who was living in Herfino. She was very traditional. She had seasonal homes. I remember when we'd go visit her, it was hard to speak with her because we only knew English, but she would butcher her sheep. She would grow her gardens, and she was a weaver, and she was living off her land. She didn't even have running water or electricity until the early 1990s. Other than that, she was very traditional, but she was also had that little bit of Christianity in her. The church would come and try to pick her up to take her to Sunday services. She would go just out of the kindness of her heart, but deep down, she still had her traditional beliefs. She died in January 10th, 2012, at the age of 103 years old. You know, the longevity of both of my grandmothers was pretty amazing. In 2012 when she died, 2014 when she died, 2012, I'm sorry. My maternal grandmother died first in January 2nd. And then 2 weeks later, my paternal grandmother died. I had them for the longest time, and then to no longer have them was a sad time, but it was also a very traumatic time too. Next slide. So as I took my grandparents apart and started to look at some of the laws and policies that affected them, I started to look at the 1918 influenza, since both of my grandparents lost their parents and they were both raised by aunts and uncles. And so then Indian 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act, and then 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act. And that's when both of my grandparents, my grandmothers married, and one relocated to Herfino and the other one lived in Indian housing in Church Rock. In 1946, we had the Indian Claims Commission Act, 1943, the Termination Policy Act. And this is where when Ella's oldest child was born, and eventually my mother at 6 years old was sent to boarding school. And then Mary's children, my dad was 10 years older than my mother, so he eventually was sent to boarding school along with his siblings. It was named Carson Boarding School. So he was there for a majority of his life. My mom doesn't talk much about the abuse that went on. But I know when you sit with her, it's just one of these things of her speaking out about what occurred and why. My dad really won't talk about it. He was physically abused pretty badly. And so he's a very quiet man. So then in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act occurred, and then the 1978 boarding school era ends. Next slide. So here's my mom. She's the little girl to the left that has a bow in her hair, and that's my grandmother Ella, and in the picture. And then my uncle is the little boy that's sitting right beside her. So my mother, Lucinda Harrison, and her maiden name was Lucinda Morgan. She's also from the Hushklishni clan, and she was born in 1943. Lucinda was raised by a grandmother and her aunts. For some reason, my grandmother, and I don't know if it was not being present because of who she was raised for, but my mother and her didn't have a good relationship. So my mom was often sent away. And eventually, when she did return home when she was older, she just helped my grandmother raise her other siblings, which she had two other daughters after my uncle there in the middle. So my grandmother went on to school and left my mother and her siblings in the care of family. After 6 years of age, the missionaries came to take my mom to Church Rock, from Church Rock, New Mexico, to the boarding school called Rehoboth. It was a Christian school, like I said before, and it was only 5 miles away from my mom's original home. But she recalls even in the summertime, she never went home. My grandfather would always come and see her during the summertime. but she eventually stayed at this school and graduated in 1962. She only saw her parents once a year from kindergarten, married at 19, and gave birth to her first child at 20 years old, who is me. She divorced in 1976 due to alcohol, domestic violence, and was a single mother with 3 children. Next slide. And this is my father, Chad Earl Warito. He is Nashashadene with the Bear Enemy Clan, and he's sitting right there in the middle with the glasses on and on the floor. He was born in 1933. He attended boarding school in Carson, New Mexico. He was physically and emotionally abused and told not to speak or write his language. My father saw violence in his own home concerning his father and mother. Many of those stories, you know, as you go along, they're hidden. You see the picture and you're often asking how home life went. And my dad would talk about it a little bit, but it was one to where he didn't say a lot unless you ponder or at least ask the critical questions of how did grandpa treat you? He knows a lot about his history and where he's from, but he was also a traditional man. So he joined the military and was stationed in Germany after he left school. He went to college for 2 years and then left the university. It's just so many of us are just like, you know, the military with so many of our Native people. It's just one of those things to where you're trying to figure out what's these patterns of what has existed. So my father was a quiet man and returned to taught his cultural ways, but my mom was against it because of the Christian church beliefs. My father's life was filled with unfulfilled dreams. He is 88 right now, but he's also a very angry man. Next slide. So I put this on because still a lot of these policies and the traumas created it are repeated down. And because we've never corrected or looked at what the government could do to correct them, we as those who are the victims continually perpetuate and take on whatever traumas existed from that time. And then it's delivered on to the children. Next slide. So when we talk about historical or intergenerational trauma and institutional trauma, this is where you have to ask, you know, the historical trauma, just like the long walk, where you have a dominant culture that perpetuates mass trauma on a population in the form of colonialism, slavery, war, and genocide. In the next phase, when trauma is ensued, the affected population shows physical and psychological symptoms in response to the trauma. Intergenerational trauma is when the population passes these traumas, responses to trauma subsequent to generations who in turn display similar symptoms. Then institutional trauma is the wrongdoings perpetuated by an institution upon individuals dependent on the institution, including failure to prevent or respond supportively to wrongdoings by individuals committed with the context of the institution. That's where boarding school comes in. And the trauma resulted from that. So when we talk about the results of trauma, and as the previous slides indicated, high rates of addiction, suicide, mental illness, sexual violence, and other ills among Native American people, which might be in some fashion influenced by historical trauma. Research has found that Native people have the highest rates of health problems, such as post-traumatic stress, depression, and substance abuse. And, you know, it's one of those things where we're often questioning who we are, but then many times we all look at the deficit and how we haven't been able to succeed, but we never look at the historical context of not only policies, but the atrocities of what our families have endured in order to move forward. Next slide. So these are just, like we said before, the strengths of our families, our resiliency, spiritual identity, clans, language, culture beliefs, and belief in community. And some of the barriers have been colonialism, assimilation, connection to land. And, you know, when we go all the way back in the taking and buying of land, our spiritual connection to that. broke our spirits. And one is, how do you reclaim that? Our connection to children because of those barriers and the relationships broken, the lack of cultural beliefs and what boarding school has done to take that away. And then the lack of belief in our community and how we can generate this community to become more whole, and what we can do to create this relationship with one another, to realize we are not alone. Next slide. And that is it. And this is me when I was a baby, and I'll talk about that next time we meet. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ronald Wakini. I am Comanche, and I am originally from Lawton, Oklahoma. And we're going to talk a little bit, and we're kind of bring this full circle and take sort of a photographic journey through my family tree, as well as taking a look at some parenting, Native American parenting practices and philosophies toward the end. So with that being said, next slide, Liz. This photograph is one of my favorites. I have entitled my presentation, The Grandmother's Unlimited Love, and that will become a little bit more clearer as we go along. This photo is of a Comanche camp, and it is facing toward the west. That is Mount Scott in the Wichita Mountains there in the background. This was what I saw my whole life growing up in Elgin. Once I went out into the backyard of my grandmother's home, I could look to the west, and this is what I saw. Now, ironically, where that camp is right now, there is a lake. Lake Latonka is right there. So any kind of historical value that this campsite may have had is now underwater. So pretty nice photos, very special in my heart. And when I look at it, I see what is lost. Now, I will be honest and admit that throughout my years of growing up, I always thought, well, that happened a long time ago. That has no bearing on me. You know, that happened hundreds of years ago. How is that affecting me now? As I have grown older and I've started doing my research, and through education and life experiences, I'm going, oh, wait, that had an impact on me. So this is why things happen. So this is what was going on. So with that being said, we'll begin. Next slide, Liz. Let's do a little bit of historical reflection. Richard Henry Pratt, as mentioned by the other presenters, he was ironically in the Civil War, he was in charge of military prison camps. So he was the individual that was chosen to be placed in charge of Native American boarding schools. So he took that prison mentality and he brought that with him to the boarding schools. And that's why everything was regimented, the formation of the line, standing at attention. They were trying to drill military practices into our young natives. The next quote, John Oberle, this is where I personally believe the transformation began as well in my family as well as all others. And I don't particularly like to read directly, but this quote is pretty powerful that I want to do it justice. The Indian must be imbued with the exalting egotism of American civilization so that he will say I instead of we, and this is mine instead of ours. John Oberle, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, 1886. They were beginning the transition of taking us from a cumulative culture where we thought about others and tried to instill in us selfishness, individualism, and I mentality that is coming from Western civilization. So this is where things began to take effect in my family. So next slide, please, Liz. This begins that first picture up in the left. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is the first photographic picture of anyone in my family tree. This is Cynthia Ann Parker. Some historical background on Cynthia Ann. She was captured off of the plains of Central Texas, somewhere around in the 1850s. And she was about, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years old when she was taken off of the plains and went to live with the Comanches. Now, historically, when Comanches were taking captives, the settlers were encroaching more and more on tribal lands. So they didn't just go and indiscriminately take. I'm sure that happened, but during this case, the Parkers were moving, and they were they moved farther west than any other settler. So they were encroaching more and more. So she was taken off of the plains of Texas, and throughout her time with the Comanches, she married Peta Nocona, who was chief of the Comanches. She had 3 children, I'm sorry. Quanah Parker, who is our great-great-grandfather, and his younger brother, Peanut, and a daughter, Prairie Flower. And that is her in that picture right there being breastfed. Now, Cynthia Ann, she's pretty well known in Texas history and Oklahoma history, as well as Comanche history. She was recaptured in the late 1870s, maybe early 1880s. She was recaptured and taken back to live with her white relatives in north to central Texas. Ironically, she was not well received when she went back. She tried numerous times to escape and get back to the Comanches where her children were, her 2 younger boys. She was passed from family to family, and eventually she ended up dying about 10, 13 years later. Her young daughter there, Prairie Flower, didn't last very long in captivity, going back in civilization with the white family. So she just didn't do well. In these photos, you can see the transition. This is Quanah Parker. He was very instrumental in the transition from our free days of roaming the plains to bringing all of the Comanche onto the reservation land around Fort Sill and Lawton, Oklahoma. And you can see where the transition is beginning in the central photo, where TP in a headdress with the war bonnet. And then we're going back to moving on into a more of a westernized suit and tie, vest, hat, porch, carriage. So this is where transition is beginning. Now, when I do this presentation, I like to point out, this is where the trauma started to begin, the photographic trauma of our family. Cynthia Ann, there's no smile there. Her hair is cut really short. I always thought, wow, when I looked at that as a younger lad, I was like, oh, wow, look at her hair. I didn't know, and I didn't realize at the time that this photo was taken really quickly after being captured, because she was somewhat of a notoriety, a star at the time, because of coming back to her white family. This was her mourning. She witnessed her husband being killed. So she was grieving, and that's why her hair is not there. Her hair has been cut short. Next slide, please, Liz. The gentleman to the left and in the upper center is Baldwin Parker Sr. He is my great-grandfather. He is the oldest son of Quanah Parker, and you can see the braids. There's still that traditional look, and we're moving more towards that westernized pants, trousers, coat. And this is where things are starting to take a transition. I want to point out that when I was putting these slides together for numerous presentation, this is where the photographic journey of males in my family starts to decrease. The center photo down on the bottom in the center, that's my grandmother right there, Ollie Parker. She was the last fluent speaker of Comanche in our family. In the upper right, that's my mom and my younger brother, Frank, and a family friend in the photo there at a powwow in Shawnee a couple of years ago. My mom will like to say, I can't speak Comanche, but I understand. And I'm like, oh, you're joshing me, Mom. No, you don't. Yeah, really, I do. I'm like, okay, well, what'd they say? Well, I don't know. I don't know that part. I'm like, okay. So things were taking the change here. This is where we started to lose some things. And ironically, my mom, she had me when she was still a teenager. So she wasn't ready to have children at the time. So I was raised 99.9% of the time with my grandmother. Now, as I look back and I'm going, well, I spent all of this time with my grandma, and I can remember her sitting at the kitchen table with all of the other elders, and they would be speaking Comanche. So why did I not learn anything? Why did she not teach me anything as we were growing up? This is where that boarding school mentality is taking over, where it's not good to speak your language. So we're just going to not do it, and we're not going to try to pass it on. Things were starting to take some changes here. In this bottom right-hand corner is my younger brother and my niece, Kayla. So here's where things also get ironic. My younger brother dances, has always danced, and as long as I can remember, as far back at powwows, he has always participated. I, on the other hand, I don't, even though we're raised in the same family, same household, same right next door, you know, all of the family members. I did not take a traditional route. I chose to hang out very differently, and that's going to be my next presentation next week. So we'll see how things kind of progressed in my life. But go ahead, next slide, Liz. Okay, my grandmother, there she is in the background in the upper left. My younger son. This is where the male pictures start to take more of an effect. My father is not there in those in the photographic history. My grandfather's not there. And then we only have a few of my great-grandfather and then just a few of Quanah. So this is where the gap is changing. And this is where I have come to realize that everything that happened in my family, we can put a stop to it now. So things are beginning to progress more toward the positive side of things. Next slide, please, Liz. Native American parenting practices and philosophies. Historically, and it has been passed through our history to our families, that our kids always came first. And that was attempted, the dominant society attempt to take that from us. They took our kids and they placed them in the boarding schools, and we lost contact. So they tried to eliminate this from us. Now, another parenting practice and philosophy is protecting your children. The children should enjoy their childhood. We always were able to roam free and do and enjoy nature. And when the boarding school and our photographic journeys and our family trees started to be documented, that was taken from us, and they tried to eliminate that from us. And now we have to watch our children closely. We keep a very dominant eye on them, very close eye on them, just with what's happening in the world today. And we see it in school shootings and school bullying and all of that tactics. So we are being forced to keep a very close eye on them. And as Melanie had presented earlier, there's no drinking, or there shouldn't have been, in our family trees and our tribes. It wasn't only until contact with the Europeans did we become really indoctrinated into alcohol. Now we're suffering through the effects of that. Now, let's go back to my photographic journey. The reason why there are no males or no photos of the males in my family is there was extensive alcohol abuse. So they're just not there in that photographic record. And now, bringing this full circle to today, there is no drinking at my house. There's nothing there that shouldn't be there. If it's illegal, immoral, or irresponsible, we're not going to tie into that at our home. Next slide, Liz. I find it interesting that a lot of my presenters talked significantly about their grandmothers and their mothers, and that not only in my family, but maybe in theirs, things have happened to our males that shouldn't have happened to them. And historically, our mothers and our grandmothers, they were the center of our lives. They always knew what to do. I could always go to my grandmother and she would always have an answer for me. I tried to emulate what she instilled in me as far as taking care of my grandkids and taking care of my kids now. I didn't always do that as well as I should have in the past, but I now realize that. And our women, they prioritized everything over the household, and they put their own needs and wants on hold in order for the kids to prosper. And my grandmother could do just about anything. There's nothing that she couldn't do that. And I could ask her for just about anything and she would give me her life if she had to. So we're going to talk further into our future sessions about bringing all of these things back into us, into our homes and our households, and try to get rid of all of the negativity that's there. Next slide, Liz. This is my little crew now. I like to put song quotes. I'm a child of the 80s, big hair, rock and roll. So I like music. And this one is one of my favorite Rolling Stones songs. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you'll get what you need. In my next story, next session, you'll understand a little bit more of this. That's my oldest son on the right, Aaron. A bit of a shout out. He's going to be entering the arena and Comanche Nation Fair here in about 3 weeks, and he's been eagerly putting his regalia together, so he's excited about it. So he's reconnecting with the culture that I lost. That's his wife, Courtney, right there on the left, and those are my 4 stepdaughters over on the left. The 2 are the twins, one on the far, second from the far left, and the one in the center. They're twins. They were about 6 years old when I married their mom, and they always thought that they were native. So a story at Comanche Nation Fair, we were walking around one day, and Joby goes, "You know everybody," and her sister Lacey goes, "Well, duh, that's because we're Comanche." But my parenting skills and my grandparenting skills have improved vastly from where they were even 5, 10, 15 years ago. So I would do just about anything for this little crew. So I think that ends my time, and I'm going to hand this back over to Ronaldo, who's going to take us through a group activity.
Okay, this is very simple, and it's not anything that's big, but the tree you're going to see before was not the tree I created. I couldn't get it to transfer over. But I want you guys to take a sheet of paper, but you can't do this now, with everything that you've been given. So what we're going to do with this tree is, you see the roots at the base of the bottom, and what's around it is, if you look at, if we were just to imagine that there's dirt all around it. And often when I look at the roots of a tree, I often, and especially when you see the leaves that are coming forth and what's going on with it, that sometimes, you know, they, and what they produce, whether it be fruit, flowers, pines, pine cones, there's various of trees based on your community. But when you're looking at this, and this is where I'm going to ask a little bit of audience help, And if we were going to look at the base of this tree where the roots are ending, you're looking at the soil. So as we look at the historical pieces of, as everyone has showed you about some of the policies and laws that were created and what shifted us. But let me get a little bit perspective from you guys about the soil that exists around the tree, and pretend this is you. And as you were prospering and growing, what disconnected you from the soil? What pulled you away that spiritually you were no longer able to connect? Just take a little look from your family side and see, where was that disconnection made to where land was no longer part of your life? There was no focus, and that we lost sight of that when years back, it was our vitalness to be connected to Mother Earth. And now as we have proceeded through time, we see the disvaluing of Mother Earth and what man has done to create this barrier that we no longer feel for what's going on around it. It was real funny. My daughter did a film called The Long Line of Ladies. And in there was an elder man who stated that the long line of ladies, or the women, as Ronnie was talking a lot as he saw this, that the women were always connected, and they were always those that prospered and nurtured and took care of the family. But then there was a disconnect, when violence started to happen and the abuse to women. So just take a little bit of time, and you can, within your chat, I'm posing the question, when do you feel your family eventually disconnected from the land and it wasn't as vital anymore? So let me give you a minute or two to put some answers in the chat, or you can respond just by the, audience. And if anybody wants to respond, go ahead, just by what you're feeling and going through. And if you want to say something, just go ahead and speak. What disconnected you from the land? Disoriented. And as I talked about back in the 1800s, and when tribes were moved, especially to Oklahoma, when you look at the 32 tribes, they were removed, and they were moved from their homelands. They were disconnected from that homeland. Boarding schools, people are saying. Family discord, boarding schools when my parents died, relocation, boarding schools, loss of language, and the flooding of our land. With my grandparents, having a boarding school in our village. Physical and sexual violence. Is there anybody who wants to speak about that? Do I have a volunteer? Urban lifestyle and religion. Grammar, diet, and grammar. Also be assimilation into the American culture. So we all have these different places, capitalism, of where we disconnected ourselves, or not by our choice. It was by the government and the moving of us and the creation of, assimilating us and the colonization of our very lives. It's something, it's one of these things. Just take a picture. If you've ever had to pull a plant out with its roots, you pull that thing out of the ground. Can you imagine you as an individual, and even your ancestors were pulled out from where you had strong roots, and you were told to believe that there's this other place you needed to go, even though it wasn't of your choosing, that this was someplace that you never even realized that you could even prosper. And it's the same way with my grandmother, the long walk of moving her from this other place and to live in this desolate place. The land was barren, and where they lived and sleep, it was very cold. They didn't have enough, protection of blankets or food. They had to endure so much. So as we look at that next portion, now we're going to go to the next phase, relocation of my mom. Okay. Place an image if you would like to use it to map this out. Okay. Now, once we look at the isolation of it, let me see, I'm going to pull out another file. We're going to pull up another one. Is it coming up? Okay, so once we look at the disconnection of land, it's the same way when I started to look, like I said, through the traumas. Now, let's get to the roots along here. So once we have the dislocation of land, so then there's behaviors that were created through our families once we were dislocated, or not dislocated, but once we were pulled from our very roots of where we were living. And then we were transplanted in another place. So when you look at this transfer of you moving or going to another place, what do you think there were traumas associated with that dislocation? Now, I talked about intergenerational trauma. I talked about historical trauma, and I talked about generational, historical, and I'm trying to get to the next word. So when we look at these traumas, and this is another thing I spoke about when we were talking about here. So when we look at the pulling out of the land, next we have to ask ourselves, by that pulling out of the land, what do you think, based on your family and your history, what traumas, whether it's addiction, alcoholism, mental illness, sexual violence, drug addiction, yeah, I said addiction, and domestic violence. There's a lot of things that came about from just that piece, and the women and the role, church, and all of these things that existed. What do you think some of these traumas are within the roots that have now perpetuated our own lives as this tree starts to grow? So let's throw something out about traumas. What do you think, what traumas from the brokenness do you think that we are living right now that you see going on? Just put them in the chat. Okay, let me see. Trying to pull it up. My PowerPoint. Okay, in the chat, just share, what do you think based on the just pulling you out and transferring you to another place and not being associated with land or where you come from? What do you think some of the traumas that have come up? Alcohol, loss of trust, drug and alcohol, anxiety and depression, indecisiveness, anger, distrust, loss, abuses, incarceration, complete loss of way of life, refusal to marry within clan systems, suicide, racism, loss of language, culture, identity, sexual violence, sense of self. See, there's this understanding, and as you're hard to say love, that's a big one. And that acknowledgement of what love is, because, and in my work, as I work with children and parents in the education system, especially those with disabilities, I've often found that, the acceptance of love, and sometimes we put trust in these places where we're not supposed to trust, and we got depression, bullying, loss of spirit. So when you look at all of those pieces and you ask about this tree of self and who you are, it's this juncture as it grows, but then it's also one of these things with traumas. As we have been in the trauma for so long, these roots, you see the wider roots and then the smaller ones, The wider ones are these consistent traumas that start to affect us, and then genetically, they start to be embedded within our DNA. And because we've not relieved it or taken it away or tried to heal, then eventually this stems into this tree of yourself and who you are. So then we get these places of, the diabetes, of some of the health issues, the alcoholism, the domestic violence, the roles of women sometimes are clouded, the patriarchy of men, dropping out of school. There's all these things that are fueling this tree and how it grows. But just as Ronnie was saying, there are those turnarounds where we can heal. And then as this tree moves up and what it produces, the fruit it's producing, and what it's being shown to the people around us. But oftentimes we don't realize how deep these traumas are setting. So based on yourself, I'm going to ask you this, and you can throw it out there yourself. What do you feel based on your family, based on this history, based on all that of the speakers that have been speaking? What are some of the areas you feel that you're trying to overcome right now? You can throw it out there if you want to. What do you see that's related to your parents, related to school, related to, and you see these leaves that are producing. But then there's also, just throw some of those things out right now. What do you feel right now that you're trying to overcome, if anything? And then we're going to do the opposite here with this whole activity. You can, I know and by seeing everything here, I know that we've been hit from all directions. And so hopefully with this presentation, as we're seeing what has occurred with us. But I also want to tell you that where these things come from, where the traumas come from, and the policies and the pulling out of and relocating you to another place and having to rebuild your lives and that disconnection from who you are and why you're there. Because it's one of these things, especially through, as we move through this. Now, it's what is this flurrying and what is coming out of those traumas based on you? Because this is a generational, intergenerational thing that is being passed on. Now, let's look at this tree again from another direction. Because you got to remember, the one direction is not the way all the time. So now if we look at this based on let's look at this, let's play a different tree. Now the different tree is the soil around it and what's going on. Maybe some of you have maintained your culture. Maybe you still have your clans. And maybe if the soil around that is, if you were relocated, you still had the language. You still had the means of passing on the traditions. So let's list some of the things that you may still recognize culturally that you do have. If we were to look at this tree in another way from another direction, list some of those things that culturally these traumas could take them. But I also know we still have a resiliency within us. What do you think? What can you show me right now that that gives you that resiliency? Just list them. What gives you the resiliency to know family songs? I know mine has been my clans, and knowing them, knowing where you come from, because our clans in Navajo are from a specific land within the Navajo tradition. I know the Hushklishinis, the Mud Clan, are from Eastern Navajo in Crown Point, New Mexico. The Nashashadene people in my clans are all from the other side of Crystal Mountain on the north side. So when I go to that area, you'll meet all the Nashusha people. Traditional foods, your grandmother's stories. So, and the reason I say this is that we have created a man-made world. And that's like when you pull out your roots and they put you somewhere else to try and grow and be. But there's a man-made world that's been created. But then there is the natural world where our songs, our dances all come from. Our family, our ceremonies, and you become healers come in that group and all of these things. And it's the place where we find in Navajo, we call it Hojo. There's a balance. So when you grow a tree that's not in the man-made world or you've been pulled out, let's try and pull that tree back into the soil and nurture who you are, despite what you're hearing and what's going on. Go back to this place, whether it's just going outside and looking at that tree, looking at a real tree, and finding out deep inside you, there's those things that have been passed on to you that are still, they're good. They create the harmony and the balance. They bring these things together. But this world has literally tried to destroy us by pulling out that tree and putting it in another place. And then we have all these traumas associated with the pulling out and why we are growing in these spaces that we don't want to grow. But let's go to another direction and see it from another way. There are roots, your family, your clans. There are good things, the passing of songs, of healing and of traditional means, whether it's through a medicine man, whether it's through, there was a way in why we're still resilient. And in the nature of all things, and with the creator and with trees and mountains and the sky, it still says we're connected. So I want you to go away with this message that we've given, to know that let's take a different look of this from this tree. Sometimes it is the trauma, sometimes it's all of those things, but there's a way to pull ourselves out of it. But it requires the healing piece. And however you decide to do that spiritually is up to you, because there are those places where we'll find that resolve and that peace. And I just go away with showing you, even though this tree is something there, but then the traumas that are showing forth, there's also good things showing. But we also have to change our language and the way we speak to one another. We have to look and respect one another. We have to understand that our coming together with others, there's a reason. But this world with technology and with all of those things has really separated us. I see that in the education world. I see that with our children. And then I see parents who don't communicate with their kids because of technology. So there's a lot of things that are going on because we're very wounded, but I also say there's a lot that we have too, but we have to pull it out and we have to learn how to shift these places within us. If we didn't have a mother or father, spiritually, you can find that connection. So anyway, I hope in some way this was not the tree I wanted, but I hope that in some way it helped you to see. And if you need to try and understand a little more, just go look at a tree and figure out what is your connectedness to this and how the light, the air, and the wind can shift and change the direction of the tree, but it also can change how the tree grows, the weather, the water. And it's about time we just sort of realize that we need to take that place and we need to ground ourselves and pull those roots deep and figure out this is who I am. But in my learning of the race and social injustice and these things when I went to grad school, it was very hard on me. I went through depression when I realized that there were all these barriers and there was a name for them and the racism involved with it. And then I eventually learned that after seeing what my family has been through, I finally said to myself, I'm not the problem. look at all this stuff that my family had to endure. And it wasn't their choice. And then the traumas and all that came with it. But just believe in yourself that you know you were not the problem. And that you have every means, if we come together with those, especially our own families and our own communities, when we hear the stories that we thought we were alone, and then we find when we speak and say them, we were never alone, because there are other people there who are experiencing the same thing. So anyway, just take that with you for now. And I thank you for sharing everything you've done. And I'm going to hand this over to Teresa to go ahead and lead us off.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sounds great. So thank you, panelists. That was wonderful. The tree exercise was also wonderful. So thank you very much for that. This is part 1 of 4 sessions. The next session that we're going to have is going to be the whys. It's going to be connecting the historical and the generational trauma to their personal experiences and the choices that our panelists made. Session 3 is going to be their personal stories, their low points, the points of making the positive changes, and the positive changes for their parenting and their parenting style in order to break the cycle of trauma. And then session 4 is going to be about providing coping strategies, advice, aspirations, forgiveness, and forgiving yourself so that we could all become better parents for our children. I do hope that you guys enjoyed today's session. I thank you very much, panelists, and I hope that we see everyone back here for the next 3 sessions. I think this is going to be very powerful as we go through this training. And I think that you're going to be leaving with some very good information. Next week, we are also probably going to be doing some breakout session and maybe some activities for the audience. So please come ready and prepared to be engaged. If anybody has any questions or has any comments before we end today, feel free to speak up, raise your hand, or whatever you'd like to do. Any questions from the audience at this time?